Hey everyone, through the years Dead by Daylight has seen a lot of different metas. I posed you all the question of which ones you loved and which ones you hated throughout the game's nearing 9-year history. Our first positive is the Ruin Undying meta, a killer meta which began at the release of the Blight and his chapter Descend Beyond. The core of this meta was the perk Hex Undying, a perk that was set to completely change Dead by Daylight upon its release. Undying had the simple yet incredibly strong effect of allowing your Hex totems to survive after being broken, moving instead to a free Dull totem, if one was available, which was sometimes up to 4. So it was a support perk or kind of a perk extender, quite a novel concept really. The main use for this perk at the time was to pair it up with the perk Hex Ruin, an already strong yet vulnerable regression perk due to it being a Hex. Together this allowed for much stronger and consistent game delay for almost every killer, weirdly allowing even the weakest a good chance, with many strong gen perks like Prove Thyself being around at the time. It was also a positive meta for survivors overall too, I think at least, as it encouraged more engagement with totems in general, and the cleansing of dull totems which otherwise before were quite pointless honestly. This meta ended with the rework of Undying in 4.5.0. The perk was still good after this rework, and was still a part of many builds, but it slowly began to fade out, with the meta truly dying around the release of Michaela and her boon perks, which both ended the Ruin Undying and wider Hex meta due to survivors now focusing far more closely on totems. The boon meta was a survivor-focused meta that begun with the release of Michaela Reed in her half-chapter Hour of the Witch. With it came a game changer for Dead by Daylight, boons. Boons were the survivor equivalent of hexes, only they were quite a bit more flexible in comparison, with them being capable of being repeatedly replaced on the same totem over and over with no consequence. The only thing killers could do was to snuff them out. This wasn't always viable though, depending on where the totem was. The strongest part of this meta was Boon's Circle of Healing, a perk which provided a 100% boost to heal speed, and the ability to self-heal within its 24-meter radius. It was incredibly strong and allowed you to reset at much faster speeds as a survivor team, taking all the killer's pressure away in an instant due to it allowing ease of healing. It also led to incredibly broken strategies and sub-metas, such as the Boilover meta, a brief meta that came with the 5.5.0 rework of Boilover, which allowed survivor teams to become near unhookable on the RPD library's top floor by using a combination of a boon totem spot and the new Boilover, which gave survivors a 25% wiggle progression whenever the killer dropped from a great height, such as the upper floor of the library. The boon meta slowly faded out over time, with Circle of Healing being slowly nerfed down across the course of 3 patches, 100% in 5.3.0 to 75% in 5.5.0 down to just 50% in 5.7.0. What's funny about all this is that the perk introduced specifically to counter boons and their issue with being replenished repeatedly was Shattered Hope, a perk which would cause totems to shatter after being snuffed. A pretty good idea to counter this. This however was added in 6.0.0, long after boons had been problematic, making it almost instantly a near unused perk. Weave Attunement Franklin's meta was a meta defined by its 2 titular perks, and it began with the release of Vecna. This meta seemed quite liked, and it was due to it being both unique but also very balanced, and quite frankly, short. The only reason it did get hate at the time was that it was somewhat disliked for its use of Franklins at its core, which has always been quite disliked on the survivor side. The way it worked was to use items in order to keep track of survivors as killer. With Franklins you'd disarm the survivor of their item, then Weave Attunement would kick in, creating a 12-meter radius around the item where you could see the survivor's aura. It was a very unique way to play, and the counters were interesting too. Either you dropped your items pre-chase, or you could choose to manually pick up and move your items as a survivor to a new location on the map's edges. You could also run counter perks like Distortion. It was cut fairly short however, with this meta largely being a product of Weave Attunement's release, and it throwing people off. It was a short but sweet meta therefore, lasting about a month or maybe even less. Debatably the very worst meta of DBD's entire history was the Gen Kick meta. This was an incredibly dull meta which gave emphasis to the dullest parts of the game for both sides, generators. It began with the initial rework of Eruption, and ended around the time of the first Skull Merchant rework. The core of it was kicking generators and regressing them by a number of different means. It was an odd one as it began sort of around the time of the huge perk rework of 6.1.0, so it took a little time for this meta to actually form, with it initially being quite a balanced and fun time whilst everyone figured out what was good to use now. The three main problematic perks of this meta were Eruption, Cool of Brine, and Overcharge. Eruption allowed you to kick multiple generators and both regress them and apply the incapacitated status whenever you down someone. Then both Cool of Brine and Overcharge, when kicking a generator with these, Cool of Brine would cause it to regress at 200% speed, and Overcharge could also do the same but within 30 seconds time. It was absolutely brutal to face, and incredibly boring as killer to make builds with. Games ground to a halt, 3-genning became incredibly popular due to just how easy it was to hold generators, and it was made even worse with the release of the Skull Merchant, a killer basically made to camp, furthering this even more, to an almost unplayable state where she could stall a game, in some cases, until server closure. It was that bad. It properly ended with the rework of Merchant and nerf of Cool of Brine, Overcharge, and Eruption across 6.6.0 and 6.7.0. The early days of Dead by Daylight were odd, but a meta did somewhat form for both sides, known simply as the original meta. This meta relied on the early days perks, which for the most part were quite mixed and relatively weak, especially on the killer side. The only options you had available were the core game's perks, and in terms of killers, these were just 3. Killers used perks like Agitation, Whispers, Original Noed, Deerstalker, Spies from the Shadows, and many other perks that today may seem sort of strange. For survivors, it was perks like Sprint Burst, Self-Care, Bond, Saboteur, and even Calm Spirit. It was a time largely of imbalance, so the little consistency that could be found in some of the perks was definitely key to surviving back then, whichever side you were on. This began to become disrupted with the subsequent release of the first 2 chapters, The Last Breath and Halloween. These chapters were disrupted with the release of new perks and mechanics. The Last Breath introduced Nurse, which permanently defined the killer meta for the next 8 years, with her being solidified as the strongest killer within months of her release. Then Halloween introduced the Obsession mechanic, and broken perks such as Decisive Strike, Object of Obsession, as well as original Save the Best for Last, which caused a pretty rough early meta, where you could recover from attacks incredibly quickly. Looking at wider DBD history, in fact, those first 2 chapters are quite disruptive. Therefore, this earlier pre-state and beginning of the game where people didn't really know what was good made it quite a pure time, and a time where everyone had to find out what was good. The only other time this sort of happened was with the 6.1.0 perk overhaul, which I do want to give an honourable mention as another time of this unclear sort of meta, where variety would have been more at the forefront. I guess we could kind of call it a variety meta, although back then variety was definitely a lot more restricted. Back to the brutal, made for this meta. This was a meta that begun around the release of the chapter End Transmission, and its new survivor, Gabriel Soma. Gabriel came with 3 perks, but one incredibly game-changing one, made for this. A perk which had the simple effect of providing a 3% boost to movement speed so long as you were injured. It's one of those things that sounds very minor, but this fundamentally broke the game and many of its interactions, with chase timings being altered by that seemingly small 3%. This percentage can mean the difference between a down and an extra 30 seconds of chase by allowing you to make pallets or windows you might otherwise not have, and simply to run stronger loops ever so slightly faster. This meta was bad not only due to it being a passive meta, as in it took no direct input from the player, but also it just threw everyone off. It encouraged bad habits and reliance on this perk as a crutch for survivors, and was simply frustrating to face as a killer, with it being made even worse in the endgame when paired with perks like Hope. This meta was put to rest in November 2023, with Made for This being greatly nerfed. The post-Ruin meta was sort of a circumstantial one that happened as a result of Ruin being nerfed down in 3.5.0. This was initially taken as a nerf at least. The perk actually got better, but at the time it was sort of hard to figure that out. The version of Hex Ruin prior was used very widely, with it making it quite difficult to complete generators due to its red skill checks that would slow progress. When Ruin got reworked to how it works perks today, it initially led to a lot of people writing the perk off and not using it for some time. The favour instead shifted to perks such as Corrupt Intervention, Pop Goes the Weasel, and tracking perks like Barbecue and Chili and Discordance. Interesting side note on Discordance was that back then it was perpetually kept at tier 1, by choice by the player. This was done in order to keep its updates far more accurate, to reset every 8 seconds rather than 12. It was one of these weird interesting quirks back then where it was actually a benefit to have it at tier 1 rather than tier 3, its yellow version over its purple version. This meta and this time was a nice time of consolidation almost, where the meta took a side turn as it figured out where to go after Ruin. Pop had received a buff not too far before, and so then became the frontrunner. It was ultimately a good thing though for generators and regression, as it encouraged to focus on hooks in order to proc Pop over reliance on Ruin to do all the work, which was often inconsistent, as well as the original version heavily punishing newer players. It actually worked to be overall healthy for survivors too, I think, with Ruin gone. One of the most unsufferable metas came shortly after this one though, the DS Unbreakable Meta, a meta which had already been present but really took its hold through 2020 and into 2021. This is a meta I have a personal hatred for, due to just how long this meta was around, with it spanning years of time. It was quite possibly in fact one of the longest surviving survivor metas of DBD history. It paired together Decisive Strike and Unbreakable, with both perks being misused. DS is designed to be an anti-tunnel perk, and Unbreakable an anti-slugging perk, but during this meta they were used instead for aggression. DS didn't deactivate back then when on a generator, unhooking, breaking, and whatever else, meaning you could run around freely and do things right in front of the killer and they could do nothing. If they picked you up, you DS'd them. If they slugged you, you used Unbreakable. This was the core of the build, but it was built up with incredibly strong perks like Dead Hard, Sprint Burst, Adrenaline, Iron Will, and Borrowed Time. It was somewhat tempered with the release of Pyramid Head in June 2020, who was able to directly counter anti-tunnel and slug measures, but it still meant almost every other killer, and far weaker ones too, were punished considerably. This meta was dull to face as a killer, and had a number of crutches for Survivor, maybe the most Survivor has ever had, and it was simply unhealthy quite frankly, to have this much to rely on. When this meta was ended with the rework of Decisive Strike in 4.6.0, it was a relief. What made this meta even worse though was how it buffs Survive with Friends. This has been a point of contention throughout the years, and this meta made it even worse with the existence of Objective Obsession too, a perk particularly strong during this time. It applied constant pressure to the killer by means of allowing the survivor using it to see them constantly, so long as you looked in their direction. Anywhere on the map, within a 96 meter range I think it was, if you were looking in the killer's direction, you could see them the whole time. This allowed persistent communication within a team and almost a live ping on where the killer was. Dark days for Dead by Daylight. And that's not even mentioning the killer side. It was Forever Freddy during this time as well, just to put it into perspective. This was absolutely the worst time for Dead by Daylight. What were the best and worst metas for you though? Let me know down below. Thanks and goodbye.